I've spent a lot of my life getting my hands dirty. I've been in sewers, up on bridges, and down in mines. I've seen some strange things out there, things that make you scratch your head. But sometimes, the stories that really stick with you aren't the ones you see with your own eyes. They're the ones you hear from somebody else, whispered around a campfire. These days, that campfire is the internet. It's a place where millions of people gather to share the parts of their lives that don't quite make sense. The moments that left them with a chill running down their spine. It's a digital collection of ghost stories, but the scary part is, the people telling them swear they're true. These aren't your typical Hollywood horror tales with big monsters and dramatic music. No, these are quieter, more personal. They're the kind of stories that sneak up on you late at night when you're alone in the house. They're about that strange noise you couldn't explain, or that feeling of being watched when nobody was there. They come from regular folks, people like you and me who just happened to stumble into a moment where the world didn't behave the way it was supposed to. Reddit is one of the biggest of these digital campfires. Hidden in those forums are threads where users share their most disturbing, unexplainable experiences. So, I went digging. I sifted through thousands of these accounts, looking for the ones that felt genuine. Here's a story that starts simple, almost boring. A college kid, let's call him Alex, moves into a new apartment. It's a cheap place, second floor across the street from another building. For the first few weeks everything is normal. Classes, unpacking boxes, the usual stuff, but then, he starts to notice something odd. In the window directly across from his, there's a mannequin. It's just a torso, the kind you see in a department store, and it's always facing his window. It's a little weird. He thinks it's an art student's quirky decoration. He doesn't think much of it at first. It becomes part of the scenery, like a tree or lamppost. But after a while he starts to notice a pattern. Every morning it's there, staring. Every evening it's there. It never moves. It's just there. One night he has a few friends over. He points out the mannequin, they all have a laugh. He comes home late from the library. He glances up at the window like he always does. This time something is different. The mannequin is gone. The window is empty. He feels relief. A little confusion. Maybe the art student moved it. He shrugs it off and goes to bed. The next morning he looks out the window. His stomach drops. The mannequin is back, not centered anymore. Pressed right up to the glass, angled, as if trying to get a better look into his apartment. That's when the real fear sets in. He knows with a certainty that chills him that this is not a decoration. Someone is moving it. Someone is watching him, using the mannequin as a tool to mess with his head. He spends the rest of the day with his blinds closed. He ended up breaking his lease, moving out a week later. He said he'd rather live in his car than spend another night with that thing watching him from across the street. Some stories remind you that there are places where the rules just seem to bend a little. This one comes from a guy who was hiking with his dog in a national forest, a place he knew well. He'd been on these trails 100 times. It was a beautiful sunny afternoon. His dog, a golden retriever, was running ahead, happy as could be. They were on a familiar loop trail, one that should have taken about an hour, but after walking for what felt like a very long time, he realized he wasn't recognizing any of the landmarks. The trees looked different. The path felt wrong. He checked his phone for the map, but he had no signal. That was strange, but not impossible. He kept walking, thinking he must have just taken a wrong turn. He called for his dog, who had run far ahead. No response. He started to get a little worried. He whistled, he called its name louder, but there was only silence. The woods suddenly felt unnaturally quiet. There were no birds, no squirrels, not even the sound of the wind in the trees. It was like the world had been put on mute. He felt a growing sense of panic, the kind you get when you're truly lost. He decided to retrace his steps, to go back the way he came, but the path behind him seemed to have changed too. It wasn't the same trail he'd been walking on just minutes before. Now he was genuinely scared. He was in a place he knew like the back of his hand, but it had become completely alien. He kept calling for his dog, his voice cracking with fear. After what felt like an eternity, he heard a faint rustling in the bushes. And then, his dog came trotting out onto the path, tail wagging as if nothing was wrong. The moment he saw his dog, everything changed. He heard the birds chirping again. The wind rustled the leaves. He looked at the path, and it was the familiar trail he'd started on. He checked his watch, expecting hours to have passed, but only 20 minutes had gone by since he last looked. This next one is the kind of story that starts with something sweet and ends with something deeply unsettling. A young woman and her boyfriend were exploring an old abandoned house out in the countryside. It was the kind of place that had been empty for decades, with peeling paint and broken windows. They were taking pictures. documenting the decay. It was all just a bit of fun. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, they found a box of old photographs, mostly black and white pictures of a family that must have lived there a long time ago. Among the photos, one stood out. It was a picture of a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair and a serious expression. She was wearing a simple dress, and standing in front of the very house they were in. There was something captivating about her eyes. The woman felt a strange connection to the picture, so she decided to take it with her. She put it in her wallet, thinking of it as a small, forgotten piece of history. They left the house and didn't think much more about the experience, other than it being a cool way to spend an afternoon. A few weeks later, strange things started to happen. The woman would hear faint noises in her apartment at night, like a child humming a simple tune. At first, she dismissed it as the neighbors or the building settling, but the humming became more frequent, and it always sounded like it was coming from inside her own apartment. Then, small objects started moving. The breaking point came one night when her boyfriend was staying over. He woke up in the middle of the night, gasping. He swore he had just seen a little girl with dark hair standing at the foot of their bed, just watching them. He was terrified. That's when the woman remembered the photograph. She pulled it out of her wallet. As she stared at the little girl's serious face, she knew. She knew that whatever was in her apartment had come with the picture. The next day, she drove back to the abandoned house, walked up to the bedroom, and put the photograph right back where she found it. The strange happenings in her apartment stopped immediately. There's a certain vulnerability that comes with being a new parent. You're responsible for this tiny, helpless human, and honestly, you worry about everything. This story comes from a new father who relied on a baby monitor to keep an eye on his newborn son. It was a video monitor. He could see and hear everything in the nursery. For the first few months, it was a source of comfort. He could check on his son without opening the door. It gave him peace of mind, but that peace was about to be shattered. One night, he and his wife were watching TV in the living room. The baby monitor sat on the coffee table beside them. Their son was fast asleep in his crib. Suddenly, a voice came through the monitor. It was a man's voice, low and raspy. It wasn't him, and it wasn't a voice he recognized.
"Wake up, little baby."
The father's blood ran cold. He and his wife stared at each other in disbelief. They looked at the video screen on the monitor. On screen, their son still slept peacefully, but the voice had been crystal clear. He grabbed the heaviest thing he could find, a fireplace poker, and ran to the nursery. His heart was pounding. He flung the door open, ready to confront an intruder. The room was empty. The window was locked. There was no one there except his sleeping son. He checked the closet. He looked under the crib. There was no sign of anyone. He went back to the living room, shaken. His wife was pale with fear. They sat, staring at the monitor, listening to their son breathe. The house felt silent. Later he learned some monitors can be hacked, especially older models. Cheaper models that use radio frequencies are also vulnerable, or sometimes they pick up stray signals from a neighbor's monitor. He tried to tell himself it was just a stray signal, a technological fluke, but he could never be sure. The thought that someone could have been watching his child and whispering through the monitor never left them. They bought a new, more secure monitor the next day, but the memory of that voice haunted them for years. This story is about a feeling we've all had. The feeling that you're not alone, even when you should be. A woman was living by herself in a small ground-floor apartment. She was a nurse and often worked late shifts, so she would come home to an empty, quiet home. One evening she came home exhausted after a long day. She kicked off her shoes, dropped her bag, and went straight to the kitchen to get a glass of water. As she stood at the sink, she had the most intense feeling that someone was standing right behind her. It was so strong the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She spun around expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. The apartment was empty. She laughed at herself, blaming it on exhaustion. She checked the locks on the doors and windows just to be sure. Everything was secure. She tried to relax, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It felt like there was a presence in the room with her, a heavy, silent weight in the air. She decided to take a shower to clear her head. She locked the bathroom door, turned the water on hot, and stepped in. For a few minutes the steam, and the sound of the water, helped her to forget the strange feeling. But then, she heard it. A soft, clear knock on the bathroom door, tap, tap, tap. She froze. She knew she was the only one in the apartment. Her heart started hammering against her ribs. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, just silence. She quickly turned off the water, wrapped a towel around herself, and listened. Nothing. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger than ever. She felt like whoever or whatever had knocked was now standing right outside the door, waiting. She was too scared to open it. She stayed in that bathroom for over an hour, sitting on the floor, listening. Finally, her fear turned into a desperate need to get out. She took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and threw it open. The apartment was still empty. Nothing was out of place. But as she walked through the living room, she noticed something that made her scream. On the foggy mirror above her dresser, someone had drawn a single, perfect smiley face in the condensation left from her shower. She had not made that mark. She grabbed her keys and ran out of the apartment, not even stopping to put on her shoes. We put a lot of trust in technology, especially things like GPS. We follow that little voice without question. This story is a reminder. Sometimes the map isn't the territory. A family driving home late at night, a husband, a wife, their 2 young kids. Long rural drive through unfamiliar woods. Husband trusts his phone GPS and chooses a shortcut. GPS directs them onto a narrow, unpaved road. They take it. 10 minutes deeper into dark woods. Road narrows, branches scrape the car. Wife grows nervous and asks if he's sure. He checks the GPS, says they're on track, highway a few miles ahead. He tells her not to worry. The car's engine sputters and dies. Complete darkness and silence, no cell signal. He tries restarting, no use. He gets out, looks under the hood, sees nothing. A cold dread washes over him, the woods are too quiet. He gets back in and locks the doors. They decide to wait until morning. They huddle together and try to keep the kids calm as hours pass. At first light, he looks out the window. What he sees makes no sense. They weren't on a road at all. No path, no trail, no road. Their car is in the middle of dense forest, surrounded by trees and underbrush. Tire tracks lead up to the car, then end abruptly. They abandon the car, walk for miles, following the morning sun, finally stumble onto the main highway. They never could explain how they drove deep into a forest that had no road. Old houses have a history. They hold the echoes of the lives lived within them. Sometimes those echoes are louder than you'd like. This story comes from a couple who bought their dream home, a beautiful old Victorian house that needed a little bit of work. They were excited to fix it up and make it their own. From the day they moved in, they noticed the house had its quirks. The floors creaked, the pipes groaned. They figured it was just the character of an old building. But soon, they started noticing other sounds that were harder to explain. It started in the master bedroom. Late at night, when everything was quiet, they would hear what sounded like whispering. It was faint, like the sound of a radio playing in another room. They could never make out any words, just the soft, sibilant murmur of voices. They searched the room, looking for an old intercom, a heating vent. But they found nothing. The whispering was always there, just on the edge of hearing, a constant, unsettling background noise to their nights. It was unnerving, but they tried to learn to live with it. The real trouble began when they decided to renovate the bedroom. They wanted to strip the old, peeling wallpaper and give the room a fresh coat of paint. As the husband started pulling the wallpaper off the wall behind their bed, he found something strange. Underneath several layers of paper, the plaster was covered in writing. It wasn't just a few scribbles. The entire wall was filled with words, written over and over again in a frantic, messy script. It was the same phrase, repeated thousands of times. I can hear them too. The couple stood there in stunned silence, staring at the wall. The frantic handwriting, the sheer obsession it must have taken to cover an entire wall with that phrase. It was terrifying. Suddenly, the faint whispering they had been hearing for months took on a whole new, horrifying meaning. They weren't the first to hear it. Someone else, a long time ago, had been tormented by the same sounds, so much so that they had felt compelled to leave a warning hidden under layers of wallpaper. They finished the renovation, but they could never sleep in that room again. The whispers seemed louder now that they knew they weren't alone in hearing them. So there you have it, a handful of stories pulled from the digital ether. Phantom roads, whispering walls, mannequins that don't stay put. Are they all 100% true? Who knows? The people who wrote them seem to believe they are, and that's what matters. That's what gives them their power. These aren't tales of monsters from some other dimension. They're stories about the world we live in. A world that every now and then shows us a side of itself that we don't understand. A world maybe a little stranger and a little bit scarier than we like to think. Why we're so drawn to these stories. We have science and technology that can explain almost everything. Map the entire globe, talk to someone on the other side of the planet, instantly. We live in an age of information, and yet, we still lean in close to hear a good ghost story. Maybe we don't want the world completely explained. We want a little mystery left. Things that lie just beyond our comprehension. Static between radio stations, shadows of an old house. These Reddit stories are the modern folklore of our time. Legends passed, not by word of mouth, but by keyboards and screens. They remind us of the unknown. Our senses can be fooled. Reality can be fragile. A big, strange world we're only seeing a tiny piece of. They tap into a fundamental human fear. The fear of a world that doesn't play by the rules we thought we knew. Next time you hear a strange noise in your house or see something out of the corner of your eye, you might dismiss it. It's just the wind, or your mind playing tricks, and maybe it is. But maybe it's not. A little glitch in the system. Thinking about these stories, wondering if you'll have one to share. The most haunting thing, the possibility that they could happen to you.